My son looked me dead in the eye at his graduation party and said, "You are no longer my mother," in front of 200 guests, after I'd sacrificed everything for 23 years. He replaced me with Martha, our hired caregiver. But when I hired that private investigator to dig into his precious new mom, let's just say the truth destroyed more than just my heart. The champagne glasses caught the light from the crystal chandelier, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. I stood in the corner of the ballroom, watching the servers arrange the final touches on Leo's graduation party. Every detail had been planned with meticulous care: the imported orchids, the string quartet, the menu I had personally selected from my restaurant's finest offerings. This was supposed to be perfect. This was supposed to be his moment. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted one of the centerpieces. 23 years of building this life, of sacrificing everything, had led to this evening. Leo would graduate summa cum laude from Columbia, and I had made sure he would celebrate in style. The ballroom rental alone had cost more than most people made in 3 months. But what was money compared to my son's happiness? The first guests began arriving at 7. I smoothed down my black silk dress, the first new dress I had bought myself in 4 years, and positioned myself near the entrance. Leo looked magnificent in his tailored tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile radiant as he greeted his classmates and professors. For a moment, watching him laugh with his friends, I felt that familiar warmth of maternal pride wash over me. Greg sat in his wheelchair near the bar, Martha hovering beside him like a guardian angel. She had chosen a flowing blue dress that made her look younger than her 45 years, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant chignon. When she caught my eye across the room, she smiled and waved, that same sweet smile she had worn for the past 3 years as Greg's caregiver. The smile that had slowly replaced mine in family photographs. The evening progressed smoothly until Leo took the microphone for his speech. I had been expecting the usual thank you to family and friends, perhaps a mention of his plans for law school. Instead, his words cut through the air like shards of glass. He spoke about gratitude, about the people who had truly supported him through his academic journey. He thanked his professors, his friends, his father for his unwavering emotional support despite his physical limitations. Then he mentioned Martha, praising her for being the maternal figure he had needed during his most challenging years. I felt the blood drain from my face as he continued. The room seemed to blur around the edges as Leo's voice grew stronger, more confident. He spoke about the importance of having people in your life who were truly present, who prioritized family over career ambitions. The words felt like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at the foundation of everything I thought I had built. Then came the final strike. Leo looked directly at me as he announced that he could no longer consider me his mother. He gestured toward me with cold precision, explaining to the room that the woman standing in the corner had been absent for every important moment of his life. He described how she had chosen business meetings over his school plays, hired strangers to raise him, and treated their home like a hotel she occasionally visited. The room fell silent. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, studying my face for a reaction. Leo's voice grew stronger, more confident with each word. He told them about missing his first steps because she was on a conference call. He reminded everyone that she had forgotten his birthday 3 times. He shared how when he broke his arm in 7th grade, Martha had rushed to the hospital, not his biological mother. When he needed help with college applications, he explained, Martha had stayed up all night with him, not the woman who claimed to love him. His voice cracked with emotion, but not the kind that brings people together. This was the crack of something breaking permanently. He declared that a real mother doesn't send money instead of showing up, doesn't hire someone else to love her child. He announced that Martha had been his real mother for 3 years now, and today he was making it official. The woman who gave birth to him, he proclaimed, was no longer part of this family. The applause started slowly, first from his college friends who didn't know our history, then from neighbors who had watched Martha walk him to school every day, while I was nowhere to be seen. Soon the entire room was clapping, and I realized with horror that this wasn't spontaneous. This had been planned. They all knew this was coming. Martha stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and Leo pulled her into an embrace. He announced to the room that this was his mother, the woman who had actually raised him. Greg wheeled forward and took Martha's hand. He declared her his wife in every way that mattered, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Then he asked her to marry him. The gasps of surprise and delight filled the room as Martha covered her mouth, nodding through her tears. Leo whooped with joy, and suddenly my son's graduation party had become Martha's engagement celebration. The DJ, apparently also in on the plan, began playing romantic music. I stood frozen in the corner, watching my family, my former family, celebrate their new beginning without me. The guests formed a circle around the happy trio, completely forgetting I existed. Someone popped champagne. Someone else called for speeches about love and family. Greg raised his glass from his wheelchair, toasting Martha as the woman who had taught them what real love looked like. The crowd echoed his sentiment, and I watched 200 people toast the woman who had stolen my life. That's when I noticed the photographer, not the one I had hired for graduation photos, but someone else, capturing every moment of my humiliation. The flash went off as I stood alone by the wall, while my family embraced in the center of the room. This wasn't just a rejection, it was a public execution, and they were documenting every moment. Leo's best friend approached the microphone, sharing how he had known Leo since freshman year and watched Martha love this family. He praised her attendance at every game, every event, every moment that mattered. He declared that this was what real parenthood looked like: more applause, more agreement, and more confirmation that I was the villain in this story they had all collectively written. The final humiliation came when Leo announced that Martha would be adopting his name. He explained that from now on she would be Martha Rodriguez because she had earned the right to be part of this family. My maiden name, the name I had given up when I married Greg, now it would belong to her. I looked around the room one more time, at the flowers I had chosen, the menu I had planned, the guests I had invited to celebrate my son's achievement. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, was being used to celebrate my replacement. And then I did the only thing left to do. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the sound of their laughter and the flash of cameras capturing the moment my family became complete without me. The drive home passed in a haze. I kept thinking about the early days, when Leo was still small enough to fall asleep in my arms after I returned from 18-hour shifts at the food cart. Back then, everything had been about survival, keeping the business afloat, paying Greg's medical bills, ensuring Leo had everything he needed for school. When had survival become abandonment? When had my love become inadequacy? I remembered the morning I had bought my first food cart with borrowed money and a prayer. Leo had been 3 years old. Greg had been unemployed for 6 months after his accident, and the medical bills were threatening to drown us. I had kissed Leo goodbye at dawn and worked until midnight, building what would eventually become a chain of successful catering businesses. Every contract I won, every employee I hired, every expansion I made, it had all been for them. The house felt different when I entered that night. It was the same house I had purchased 5 years ago, the same house I had renovated to accommodate Greg's wheelchair, the same house where I had barely spent more than a few waking hours each day. But now it felt foreign, as if I were trespassing in someone else's life. Greg was already asleep when I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. He had moved to the guest room on the first floor 2 years ago, claiming it was easier for his physical therapy routine. Martha had suggested the arrangement, explaining that Greg needed uninterrupted sleep for his recovery. At the time, her concern had seemed touching. Now I wondered if it had been strategic. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, staring at the framed photograph on my nightstand. It showed the 3 of us at Leo's high school graduation, Greg in his wheelchair, Leo in his cap and gown, and me standing slightly apart, my smile tight with exhaustion. Even then, I looked like an outsider in my own family portrait. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by memories that felt both precious and poisonous. I remembered Leo's first steps, taken in the kitchen of our old apartment while I was preparing dinner between business calls. I remembered his first words, not Mama or Dada, but a garbled version of my name as I rushed past his high chair to answer the phone. Even his earliest attempts at communication had been shaped by my absence. The construction accident that had ended Greg's career as an electrician had changed everything. One moment we were a normal young family with typical dreams and struggles, and the next we were drowning in medical debt and uncertainty. Greg's spine injury had been severe enough to require multiple surgeries, but not severe enough to qualify for full disability benefits. The gap between his limited compensation and our mounting expenses had fallen to me to fill. I had always been resourceful, but those first months after Greg's accident had pushed me beyond anything I had imagined possible. The food cart business had started as a desperate attempt to generate quick income. I had no experience in food service, no business training, no connections in the industry. What I had was desperation and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. The early morning routine had become sacred. Up at 4 to prep ingredients, arrive at the cart location by 6, serve breakfast and lunch crowds until 3, then handle paperwork and supply ordering until dinner time. Greg's physical therapy appointments, Leo's school events, household management, everything else had to fit around the business schedule or be delegated to others. Martha had entered our lives 3 years ago, recommended by Greg's physical therapist as someone who could help with his daily care routine. She had arrived with impressive credentials and a warm demeanor that immediately put everyone at ease. Within weeks, she had transformed our chaotic household into a model of efficiency and comfort. While I worked 15-hour days expanding the business from 1 cart to 3, then from carts to a catering company, Martha was home creating the kind of domestic stability I had always intended to provide someday. She cooked nutritious meals, helped Leo with his homework, drove him to extracurricular activities, and provided Greg with the kind of attentive care that made his daily struggles more bearable. I had been grateful for her presence, even as I noticed the subtle ways our family dynamic was shifting. Leo stopped running to greet me when I came home late, preferring to finish his dinner at the table with Martha and Greg. Family discussions about school events or weekend plans began happening without me, the details relayed to me secondhand when I was available to listen. The financial success of the business had allowed us to move to a better neighborhood, to provide Leo with private tutoring and enrichment activities, to ensure Greg had access to the best medical care available. But success had also demanded more of my time, not less. Each new contract, each expansion opportunity, each crisis that required my personal attention, they all pulled me further away from the life I was working so hard to support. I had convinced myself that the sacrifices were temporary, that once the business was fully established, I would be able to step back and reclaim my role as wife and mother. But there was always another opportunity, another crisis, another reason why I couldn't delegate or reduce my involvement. The business had grown into something that required my constant attention, and I had grown into someone who couldn't imagine existing without that constant demand for my energy and focus. The morning after Leo's graduation party, I woke with a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. The house was quiet in the way that only came on weekend mornings, but there was something different about this silence. It felt deliberate, planned, as if the usual sounds of family life had been carefully orchestrated to exclude me. I could hear the gentle murmur of voices drifting up from the sunroom, the clink of silverware against china, the comfortable rhythm of a conversation that had been happening without me for longer than I cared to admit. Greg and Martha were having their usual breakfast together, probably discussing the day's physical therapy schedule, meal planning, and whatever other domestic arrangements they had established in my absence. The ease of their routine, the intimacy suggested by their quiet laughter, felt like another betrayal in a night full of them. Down the hallway, Leo was likely sleeping off his celebration, secure in the knowledge that his real family would be there when he woke up, ready to support whatever came next. The thought of his peaceful sleep, his confidence in their love, made my chest tighten with a mixture of grief and rage that I wasn't sure how to process. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy suit that projected authority and confidence, armor for the battle I now knew I was fighting. The woman in the mirror looked different from the one who had fallen asleep the night before. Her eyes were harder, her mouth set in lines that suggested she was done being the victim in other people's stories. There were phone calls to make, accounts to review, legal documents to examine. If I was no longer welcome as a family member, then it was time to clarify my role as a business owner and financial provider. More importantly, it was time to understand exactly what had been done in my name while I was too busy working to pay attention. The first call was to my accountant, requesting a complete audit of all family financial arrangements. My voice was steady as I explained that I needed to understand every transaction, every transfer, every expense that had been processed through our joint accounts over the past 3 years. The timing wasn't coincidental. It matched exactly with Martha's arrival in our lives. The second call was to my attorney, scheduling an emergency consultation about asset protection and estate planning. There were questions I needed answered about signature requirements, authorization protocols, and what kind of financial activity could be conducted without my explicit knowledge or consent. The third call was to the bank, implementing an immediate freeze on all joint accounts pending further review. Each call felt like a step away from the person I had been and towards someone I was still discovering, someone who no longer trusted the people she had spent decades supporting. Around noon, Martha found me in my home office, surrounded by financial documents and legal paperwork. Her expression carried that familiar mix of concern and competence that had made her so valuable to our family. But there was something else underneath it now, a watchfulness that I had never noticed before, or perhaps had never been looking for. She asked if everything was all right, her voice carrying the same caring tone she used when discussing Greg's medication schedule or Leo's college plans. She mentioned, almost casually, that Greg had been unable to access his usual account for his morning errands, and wondered if there might be some kind of technical problem with the bank's systems. The question was perfectly reasonable, exactly what a caring household manager might ask when faced with an unexpected complication. But I found myself studying her face more carefully than I ever had before, looking for signs of the manipulation that must have been there all along, hidden beneath her mask of devoted service. I explained that I was conducting a routine financial review, nothing for her to worry about. The lie came easily, and I watched her reaction with new eyes. She lingered in the doorway for a moment, as if waiting for more explanation, then smiled and offered to bring me lunch. The smile was exactly the same one I had seen thousands of times before, but now it felt calculated rather than genuine. When I declined, saying I had a business meeting to attend, her smile faltered slightly, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to catch it. For the first time in 3 years, I saw something other than serene competence in Martha's expression. There was a flicker of something that might have been concern or calculation, or perhaps the first hint of fear. The meeting with my attorney that afternoon revealed information that changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my family. Spread across his conference table were financial records that told a story of systematic deception spanning the past 2 years, exactly the period when I had been most focused on expanding the business and least attentive to domestic affairs. Greg had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into personal accounts accessible only to him. The amounts were significant, tens of thousands of dollars moved in carefully structured installments that avoided triggering automatic bank notifications. The pattern was too consistent, too well planned to be anything other than deliberate financial fraud, executed by someone who understood exactly how much he could steal without being detected. More disturbing were the insurance policy changes that had been made without my knowledge or consent. Greg had updated his life insurance beneficiaries, removing me entirely and naming Leo and Martha as primary recipients. The paperwork showed that these changes had been made gradually over the course of 18 months, creating a paper trail that suggested I had been systematically eliminated from his financial future. Even more shocking was the attempted addition of Martha's name to the deed of our house. The paperwork had been prepared and submitted, requiring only both spouses' signatures to be processed. The attempt had been blocked only because the title company had insisted on my physical presence for such a significant change, but the intention was clear. They had been planning to give Martha legal ownership of the home I had purchased with my own business profits. The financial investigation revealed a pattern of deception that stretched far beyond simple money transfers. Credit cards had been opened in my name and used for purchases I had never made, expensive gifts, restaurant meals, weekend trips that I had never taken. Business expenses had been charged to personal accounts, then reimbursed through the complex web of transfers that Greg had established, creating a money laundering system that used my own business as cover for theft. Even Leo's college fund had been accessed repeatedly, with withdrawals that didn't correspond to any tuition payments or educational expenses. The money that was supposed to secure his future had been systematically drained to fund the lifestyle of the people who were planning to replace me in his life. The betrayal was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that I felt a grudging admiration for its scope and ambition. Martha, it appeared, had not simply been taking care of my family. She had been positioning herself to replace me entirely. The caregiver's salary we had been paying her was supplemented by systematic theft that had been enabled by Greg's cooperation and concealed by my own absence from the day-to-day management of our household finances. Every month I had spent building my business was a month they had spent building their case for why I wasn't needed. But the evidence raised questions that were even more painful than the betrayal itself. How long had Greg been planning this deception? How much of Leo's rejection had been orchestrated by people who saw me as an obstacle to their own security and happiness? Had I been so focused on providing for my family that I had failed to notice they were actively working to eliminate me from their lives? The scope of the conspiracy became clear as my attorney continued his presentation. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between Greg and Martha outside of normal business hours, suggesting a relationship that went far beyond professional caregiving. Text messages revealed discussions about my work schedule, my travel plans, my availability for family events, information that had been used to plan activities that would demonstrate my absence and Martha's presence. Social media posts showed a carefully curated narrative of family life that gradually erased me from the picture. Photos of Martha helping Leo with homework, attending his school events, celebrating his achievements became the dominant story of his teenage years. My own sporadic appearances in family photos made me look like a distant relative rather than his mother, someone who occasionally showed up for major events but wasn't part of the daily fabric of his life. Email records revealed coordination between Martha and various service providers, tutors, coaches, doctors, who had gradually been redirected to communicate with her rather than me. My role as Leo's mother had been systematically transferred to Martha through a series of small, seemingly innocent changes that had the cumulative effect of erasing my parental authority. Financial records showed that Martha had been using the stolen money to create experiences and purchase gifts that enhanced her bond with Leo, while making me appear neglectful by comparison. Expensive birthday presents that she gave him were funded by money stolen from me, creating a situation where I was literally paying for my own replacement in my son's affections. The investigation revealed that Martha's manipulation had extended to Greg's medical care as well. She had gradually taken over communication with his doctors, physical therapists, and insurance providers, positioning herself as his primary caregiver while documenting my absence from his medical appointments. The narrative she created suggested that I was an uncaring wife who had abandoned her disabled husband, rather than a woman working 18-hour days to pay for his treatment. Most chilling was the discovery that Martha had been researching my business activities, my financial assets, and my legal vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of someone planning a hostile takeover. She had copies of contracts I had never shown her, knowledge of business relationships I had never discussed at home, and detailed information about my personal financial situation that could only have been obtained through systematic snooping and document theft. The evidence showed this wasn't just financial fraud, it was psychological warfare designed to isolate me from my own family, while creating legal and financial justification for my removal from their lives. Martha hadn't simply been taking care of my family. She had been conducting a years-long campaign to convince everyone, including Leo, that I was the problem that needed to be solved. The legal implications were staggering. The stolen money alone was enough to constitute felony fraud, but the identity theft, the insurance fraud, and the attempted property theft created a web of criminal liability that could result in decades of prison time. More importantly, the documentation of their conspiracy provided legal grounds for recovering not just the stolen money, but punitive damages that could financially destroy everyone involved. As I sat in my attorney's office, surrounded by evidence of the most intimate betrayal imaginable, I felt something shift inside me that I barely recognized. The woman who had spent 23 years sacrificing everything for her family's happiness was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was just another form of victimization. The investigation was just beginning, but already I could see the shape of my revenge taking form. They had used my absence against me, turned my sacrifices into weapons, and convinced my own son that I was the enemy. Now it was time to show them what happened when you underestimated the woman who had built everything you were trying to steal. The war they had started with their betrayal was about to become a legal and financial reckoning that would destroy not just their plans, but their futures. And unlike their campaign of whispers and manipulation, my counterattack would be conducted in broad daylight, with the full force of the law behind it. They had made the mistake of assuming that my love made me weak. They were about to discover that my love, when betrayed, made me absolutely ruthless. The legal process that followed was both exhausting and enlightening. Depositions revealed the extent of the conspiracy against me, but they also forced me to confront my own role in creating the circumstances that had made such deception possible. I had been so determined to be the perfect provider that I had neglected to be an active participant in my own life. Greg's testimony was particularly revealing. He described feeling abandoned and emasculated by my success, resentful of his dependence on my income, and grateful for Martha's presence as someone who made him feel valued and needed. His physical limitations had become emotional weapons that he wielded to justify his actions and deflect responsibility for their consequences. Leo's deposition was harder to endure. He spoke about feeling neglected and overlooked, about craving the kind of maternal attention that Martha provided so naturally. His resentment toward me was genuine, but it had been carefully cultivated by people who benefited from our estrangement. The boy who had once fallen asleep in my arms had grown into a young man who saw me as the villain in his own story. Martha's testimony was the most illuminating of all. Under oath, her carefully constructed persona crumbled to reveal someone who had identified a vulnerable family and systematically exploited their weaknesses for her own gain. She had seen Greg's resentment as an opportunity, Leo's need for attention as a tool, and my absence as a vulnerability to be leveraged. The financial restitution was significant, but it couldn't repair the relationships that had been destroyed by years of manipulation and neglect. The court ordered Greg to repay $347,000 in stolen funds, plus interest and penalties. His disability benefits were garnished down to the legal minimum, leaving him with barely enough to cover basic expenses. Within 2 months, Greg lost the house. The mortgage payments, combined with the court-ordered restitution, made it impossible for him to maintain the property I had bought and renovated for his disability. He was forced to move into a subsidized housing complex across town, a 1-bedroom apartment in a building that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Leo's college fund, which they had systematically drained for their elaborate lifestyle, was completely gone. His law school dreams evaporated overnight when he couldn't secure financing without a co-signer, and I was no longer willing to help. Instead of Columbia Law School, he found himself working double shifts at a restaurant to pay for his final semester, his academic achievements meaningless without the money to continue. The stolen credit cards had destroyed his credit score along with mine. The financial aid office at Columbia informed him that his family's complex financial situation made him ineligible for most assistance programs. He went from graduating summa cum laude to serving tables to pay off student debt that shouldn't have existed. Martha's arrest was particularly satisfying. It happened at the grocery store where she shopped every Tuesday, buying organic produce with money she had stolen from my accounts. The handcuffs looked strangely appropriate against her designer dress, also purchased with my money. The local newspaper ran her mugshot with the headline, "Caregiver turned con artist." and I kept a copy in my desk drawer. The trial revealed the full scope of their deception. Martha had been running the same scam on 2 other families simultaneously, playing the role of devoted caregiver while systematically draining their accounts. Greg wasn't her first disabled husband, he was her third. The previous 2 had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving her substantial insurance payouts that she had quickly spent and then moved on to find new victims. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who preyed on vulnerable families, exploiting their trust and desperation. She had researched our family extensively before applying for the caregiver position, identifying Greg's resentment and Leo's emotional needs as weaknesses she could exploit. During her testimony, Martha tried to claim she had genuinely cared for the family, but when confronted with evidence of her previous cons, her facade cracked completely. The jury saw her for what she really was, a predator who had destroyed multiple families without remorse. Greg's testimony was even more devastating to watch. Under cross-examination, he broke down completely, admitting that Martha had manipulated him from the beginning. She had convinced him that I didn't love him anymore, that his disability made him worthless in my eyes, that I was planning to leave him anyway. His desperation and self-pity had made him the perfect accomplice. He sobbed on the witness stand as he explained how she had told him he deserved better. She had said he was a real man, that he shouldn't have to depend on a woman who didn't respect him. She had made him feel valuable again. The prosecutor showed no mercy, asking him if he had decided to steal from his wife, the woman who worked 18 hours a day to support his medical care. He stammered that he had thought she wouldn't miss it. She had so much, and they had nothing. The prosecutor pressed further, asking what exactly he had nothing of. He pointed out that Greg had a home she bought him, medical care she paid for, and a son she was putting through college. Greg couldn't answer. The truth was too ugly. They had nothing of what mattered to them: control, pride, the feeling of being the center of someone's world. Martha had given them that feeling by turning them against me. Leo's testimony was the hardest to watch. Unlike Greg, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what they had done. He spoke about the manipulation, the way Martha had gradually poisoned him against me, the lies she had told about my motivations and feelings. He testified that she had said his mother didn't want to be around them, his voice barely audible. She had told him that Mom was looking for excuses to leave them, that the business was more important to her than family. She had made it seem like Mom was the problem, and that they were better off without her. When asked about the graduation speech, Leo's composure cracked. He admitted that Martha had written it. She had said it was time to set boundaries with toxic people. She had told him that public rejection would force his mother to either change or leave them alone. He had thought he was being strong. The defense attorney tried to argue that Leo was just a young man influenced by adults he trusted. But the prosecution had phone records showing hundreds of calls between Leo and Martha, text messages where they planned my public humiliation, social media posts where Leo had complained about his absent mother while praising his real mom, Martha. The evidence showed this wasn't just financial fraud. It was psychological warfare designed to isolate me from my own family. When the verdicts came down, I was sitting in the front row of the courtroom. Martha received 8 years for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Greg avoided jail time due to his disability, but the civil judgment left him financially ruined for life. As Martha was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with pure hatred. No more sweet smiles, no more caring concern, just the face of someone who had been caught and was furious about it. But the real victory came afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom. Greg sat in his wheelchair, looking older than his 52 years, while Leo stood beside him awkwardly. They had nowhere to go, no money, no home, no plans. Leo approached me hesitantly, starting to call me Mom. I interrupted him before he could continue. I told him not to, reminding him that he had made his choice at that graduation party, in front of 200 people. He had said I wasn't his mother anymore. He flinched as if I had slapped him. He protested that he had been manipulated, that Martha had lied to them about everything. I pointed out that Martha didn't force him to humiliate me publicly. Martha didn't force him to steal from his college fund. Martha didn't force him to call her his real mother while I stood in the corner like a stranger. I kept my voice calm, professional, as I explained that he had made those choices because they felt good in the moment. He protested that he was 19 years old. I reminded him that he was old enough to know right from wrong, old enough to remember who actually raised him for the first 16 years of his life, old enough to question why a woman he'd known for 3 years suddenly mattered more than the woman who gave birth to him. Greg wheeled forward, pleading that they needed help. He had nowhere to go. I looked down at him. This man I had loved, had worked myself to exhaustion to support, had sacrificed everything to care for. I told him he should have thought about that before he decided I wasn't family anymore. He stammered about making mistakes. I corrected him, explaining that he had made choices. He had chosen to steal from me. He had chosen to replace me. He had chosen to publicly reject me. Those weren't mistakes. They were decisions he made because he thought he'd get away with it. I turned to walk away, then stopped. I mentioned that the house he had lost, I had bought it back at auction the previous week. I was turning it into a rental property. The monthly income would help fund my retirement, the retirement he had tried to steal from me. The look of devastation on his face was exactly what I had hoped for. They had taken everything from me, and now they had nothing while I had everything. As I walked out of the courthouse, I heard Leo calling after me, his voice breaking as he apologized repeatedly. But I didn't turn around. Some words, once spoken, can never be taken back. Some rejections, once made public, can never be forgiven. They had chosen Martha as their family. Now they could live with that choice. But the legal victory felt hollow compared to the personal losses it represented. I had recovered my money, but I had lost my family. The house that I had bought for us became a monument to my own isolation. Each room held memories of the life I had thought I was building, now revealed as an elaborate fiction that had never really included me. The business that had consumed so much of my energy continued to thrive, but it no longer felt like a meaningful accomplishment. The success I had achieved seemed pointless when there was no one left to share it with, no one who understood the sacrifices that had made it possible. I had become wealthy and successful and utterly alone. The final legal proceedings took place on a gray October morning almost a year after Leo's graduation party. Martha was sentenced to 2 years in prison for financial fraud, her carefully constructed life unraveling as publicly as she had tried to construct it. Greg faced no criminal charges, but lost his home and his illusions about the woman he had chosen over his wife. Leo attended the sentencing, perhaps hoping for some form of reconciliation or closure. When he approached me afterward, his expression was different from the confident young man who had disowned me in front of our friends and family. The past year had changed him, stripped away some of the certainty that had made his rejection so devastating. He spoke about regret and manipulation, about understanding now how Martha had influenced his perception of our relationship. He asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding what had been broken, of finding a way back to being mother and son. His words were careful and sincere, but they came too late to bridge the distance that had grown between us. I looked at this young man who shared my DNA but not my life, who had been shaped by my sacrifices but not my presence, and felt a mixture of love and loss that defied simple resolution. He was my son, and he was a stranger, a reminder of both my greatest hopes and my most profound failures. The conversation was brief and polite, filled with the kind of careful courtesy reserved for people who have hurt each other beyond repair. We exchanged contact information and promises to stay in touch, both of us knowing that the relationship we had lost could not be recovered through good intentions alone. Driving away from the courthouse, I felt a sense of completion that was neither happy nor sad, but simply final. The legal battles were over, the financial crimes had been punished, and the people who had betrayed me were facing the consequences of their choices. Justice had been served, but it had not restored what had been taken from me.